Hello, welcome to this section of Unit 305 on the Level 3 Award Education and Training. This is assessment methods and assessment. It's primarily for those people who were unable to make the online session. So I'm just going to go through this now. Right, so before you continue, I'd like you to pause this video and head over to Moodle. And on the Moodle page, in the section called Assessment, there's a video from Sir Ken Robinson. You just click on that. Well, I'm not. It's very interesting. So, and then once you've done that, just then, start this video again. Right. What I'd like you to do is think about what is assessment. You can think about what Sir Ken Robinson said there. And just think about this and gather your initial thoughts. I'll give you a little bit of time just to make a note, not a lot of time. Okay, so assessment. Well, assessment is basically the bridge that links teaching and learning. You've got teaching on one side, but how do we know if that's been effective? Because we've got the learning on the other side. There has to be something that links those two, and that's basically what assessment is. So now just think about, just for a second, why do we assess? What is important? Why must we do it? Just 2 seconds. We'll come back to these notes later on. Okay, so here are some potential reasons why we assess. So you might see whether you had these or had something else. So we got to measure progress or ability, to diagnose strengths and weaknesses, to give feedback, to give a grade, to motivate learners, to reinforce learning, or as an organisational awarding body requirement, or to accredit previous learning. So there are some examples, and there are a lot more. So let's move on again. So assessment needs. Now these are some of the needs that a tutor needs with assessment. So a tutor needs to explain the learning aims and objectives to learners and to check their understanding of those. The whole point, and it's why your book and your modules all have these learning outcomes and assessment criteria, which are themselves learning outcomes, is if that's what is being, that is the target, then we've got to make sure that you're on that path and that you understand those. And this is what we talk about when we talk about constructively aligned. Everything should be constructively aligned to those learning outcomes so that when we get to the end, they are achieved. We need to demonstrate the standards learners are required to achieve and to help them recognise when they have achieved that standard. We need to give effective feedback and assessment decisions so that learners know how to improve. I think that's really key. We need to demonstrate high expectations and make it obvious to learners that they believe that they can improve on their past performance. We need to provide regular opportunities for teachers and learners to reflect on the last performance and review learners' progress. We also need to, I'm in the way, I'm in the little corner here. So we also need to develop learners' self-assessment skills so that they can recognise what aspects of their own work they need to improve. Right. Well, I hope that makes sense. So there are some principles to consider, 5 W's and a H, as my colleague likes to use. So you think about who is assessing, why are you assessing, what are you assessing, when are you assessing, where are you assessing, and how are you assessing? Interesting questions just to keep in your head there for a while. So, assessments should be, well, they should be linked to the course aims and objectives. If you've said, the whole point about this is that you will understand this. For example, one of the learning outcomes on this course here is, I'll just pull them up across here actually. So for this one here, understand how to involve learners and others in the assessment process. So we have to explain why it is important to involve learners and others in the assessment process. Explain the role and use of peer and self-assessment in the assessment process, and to identify sources of information that should be made available to learners and others involved in the assessment process. So what we need to do is, if those are our learning outcomes, then we need to make sure that our activities are linked to those learning outcomes so that they are being achieved in the long run. Assessment should be an integral part of the lesson course. Actually, you should be assessing all the time. You'll see this when we come into a little bit more depth on formative assessment. But if you're going to introduce the learning outcomes, you need to check your learners understand those learning outcomes. Otherwise, there's no chance they're going to get anywhere before we even started. Your assessments need to be pitched at the right level. It's not much use us asking very young people or people with low ability to produce a dissertation. It's just unrealistic. They need to be in a suitable form. It's not always about written essays and assignments like your microteach. Microteach is a practical assessment, and for plumbers you could think of a practical assessment as opposed to written assessments in that case. They need to be inclusive, and this is really important. We need to pay attention to what our learners are able to do. It's no good doing a written examination for somebody who is blind. We also have to pay attention to ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and therefore we need to design and make sure that our assessments have inclusivity built into them, or can be adapted for inclusive use. We need to make sure they're fit for purpose. It's no good assessing somebody on something that is not of purpose and of use in the longer run. And we need to make sure they're fair. I think that pays, for example. Now, useful method for this, and there is a handout of this on Moodle as well, is VACRS. And that means that assessments should be valid, authentic, current, reliable, and sufficient. Nice little thing there, a nice little cartoon. I'll let you look at it in your own time. So valid means it has to be linked to the methods, and the evidence and the methods should clearly link to any assessment criteria. This is this constructive alignment again. You need to look at the verb in the criteria and what does it ask for. So we just pop back over here now. And we've got explain why it is important to involve learners and others in the assessment process. So that's part of the thing that you'll be putting in for the written part of this assessment. And you will therefore have to explain why that is the case. We need to make sure we have enough information for you and that you've learnt enough so that you can answer that. But when you're writing, remember to look at that verb. You know, if it says explain, well, that's what you need to do. If it says describe, well, then you need to describe it. If it says summarize, then you need to summarize it. Okay, if the criteria asks for a demonstration of safe use of equipment, then an essay describing them would not be valid. Well, it has some validity, but it is not as valid as a practical examination in that case. Okay, so now let's just scroll up here. Authentic. Well, the authentic is that the work of the learner? Is there a statement confirming that? Is it photographic evidence? Is the learner identified? We need to be aware of plagiarism and copying. There is no point if it's not our actual learner that's done that assessment. We need to prove that it is the learner who has done that. In this day and age of cut and paste, that's where we get to this plagiarism and copying issues. So that's authentic. Needs to be current. So are the subjects covered up to date? Has the legislation or the syllabus changed? Is the work submitted from this academic year? And if there's a photographic evidence that is dated and that date is clearly stated. We just make sure that it is current. Reliable. Work must be robust. Can the work be repeated by the learner under different circumstances? Could different learners in another group duplicate the outcomes? Reliable really helps us to see that the learning has taken place. Sufficient. Is the work in enough depth for the credit or level of the qualification the learner is working towards? In this case, we're looking at level 3, and your student guide or your book will have what that means in terms of what we expect at that level. It's different to what's expected at level 6 or level 7, which are degree and master's levels. And then obviously, if the criteria says provide 3 examples, are 3 examples given? If it asks for 3 examples, you need to provide 3 examples. Okay, so methods of assessment. Well, there are a few notes on this PowerPoint somewhere, but methods of assessment, basically there are 3 types: ipsative, formative and summative. You won't hear ipsative very often. You'll hear diagnostic or initial assessment. I just like ipsative, formative and summative because you tend to remember they are the atives of the self, for the self and from the self. So diagnostic and initial assessment are things that we do at the start. We need to know what that learner knows before we start doing them. So we tend to run assessments like the West test to see what their levels of literacy are like. But at the start of every session, you can just ask, what does anybody know about this? Do you already know something? Then you're taking an initial assessment, and you can use that to adapt your learning at the time. Formative assessments are assessments that you're doing along the way. They are what we will look at later with Dylan Wiliam for learning, assessment for learning. And they're in class things like questioning, discussion, etc. We'll look at those in a bit more depth. And then there's summative assessment. Now, summative assessment is at the end. It's the final assessment. So summative assessment is something like an essay or an exam. And it's called summative because that's basically where we need you to hit those assessment criteria from the start of your course. And that's how we measure them against qualification standards. And then, although there's only 3, it's rapidly becoming the case where there is a 4th. And this 4th one is something called interim assessment. Interim assessment has been going on for a long time, but it's gathering a lot more weight now. So a lot of schools will do mock exams, mock tests. You might have an essay that you do midway through your course. Now that, if that is not used to provide feedback for you to use and act on for the future, then it is not a formative assessment. It becomes an interim assessment because it becomes more summative. So it is basically a formative assessment that thinks it's a formative assessment that's actually used as a summative assessment and is not given any feedback to go forward. Really, they're not fit for purpose and they shouldn't be used. Okay, now there's another video next just to go through. So I'll just bring over the Moodle page again. So now I've actually put another one on the Moodle page in case you get a little bit of trouble and you get stuck between formative and summative. I've stuck one up there. But this video is formative, summative, diagnostic, another form for ipsative. Okay. And then watch that and then come back to this. Right. So, types of assessment. Now, we would have done an activity in the online session. So, what I'd like you to try to do is think for a couple of minutes, compile a list of the following. An example of ipsative, initial or diagnostic assessment. An example of formative, example of summative, and an example of an interim assessment. I would just pause this video for a little bit whilst you do that, and then restart when you're ready. Okay, well hopefully you've got a few of those. So an example of an ipsative of initial will be we're just about to do a session on reflective practice, and I stand at the front of the class and I say, right, okay, so who knows about reflective practice? Have any of you done this before? So I'm taking a little bit of an initial assessment at the start of that session. An example of a formative assessment. Well, we might have a discussion about reflective practice in the workplace, and during that discussion I can find out where the learners are at that time. So that's a type of formative assessment. You use these all the time without thinking about them. A summative assessment. A summative assessment is something at the end. So summative assessment will be something like the assignment you have to write for this particular unit. It's also a bit interesting to note that any assessment that is not used formatively is a summative assessment because it's not acted on. So technically, there is an argument at the end of your lessons, if you're then assessing the learning in that lesson, that's a summative assessment. Although, and this is where it gets a little bit weird, if you then use that assessment to help define or alter future learning, then it is a summative assessment that you are using formatively. My personal belief is that any assessment that does not have formative use is not really fit for purpose, but that's my view. And then an example of an interim assessment. So you might have provided an essay during the middle of a course and nobody has given you any feedback on it that will help you with developing that or doing it for the future. A good version of an interim assessment would be something like a draft copy of an assignment. Right, so we're going to look at formative assessment now, because formative assessment is the real key to learning. There is another video, and this is a really important video by Dylan Wiliam. You'll see it's here. Just click on that and watch that, and then come back to this video. Okay, so to put what Dylan Wiliam is saying there into a bit more sense, we've got formative assessment, short, medium and long cycle, and short time span, longer time span, and then looking at it from an impact point of view. So let's just push myself over here. So a long cycle will be across teaching units. Now this is where technically you're then building these formative assessments over a period of time to check the learning is staying on track. There can be forms of interim assessment, provided they're being used formatively, then they're fit for purpose. In the medium cycle, that's right between teaching units. So you've already done 2 units. Some of that assessment is being used to inform this assessment and your development. Short cycle is within and in between lessons. Right, so length, well, short cycle, that's your minute by minute and day by day. Those are your mini formative assessments taking place in every single session. In the medium cycle, you might be 1 to 4 weeks, and this is where we can get at our individual learning plans and see how we're doing slightly over a bit more time. And then longer time is like year, 4 weeks to 1 year. And on this, it's really just at the start and then the end of the course, really, which is not technically a very effective formative assessment. So, short cycle, instant engagement, responsiveness, you can check that because you're physically there. Medium cycle, well, students should be involved in that, so that's where the ILPs are really powerful. Monitoring curriculum alignment, this is where we should be getting your feedback at the end of the course for how we can make future courses better. Then that gives it formative use for the course itself. Okay, what we got here now? So what does this actually mean? Well, the important thing about formative assessment, and really any kind of assessment, is there are 3 areas. There's the assessment that the teacher gives, the assessment that the individual makes themselves, and the assessments that are made by peers. The personal student assessment is vital because the learning is for that student. If that student doesn't learn how to assess themselves and know whether they're reaching the targets, then they won't reach the targets, even if you tell them. They have to know they've done it. That's why student self-assessment is vital. Peer assessment is really quite interesting because actually it's how we talk to people. Learners will not necessarily want to show themselves as slightly weak to a tutor or a lecturer, so they will sometimes say they understand something even if they don't. However, when they speak to a peer, they do tend to tell the truth. And also, you believe your peer group. It's that social constructivist type learning that you've done in earlier modules. So, all of these, where the learner is going, are about clarifying, sharing, and understanding the learning intentions. You can't get somewhere if you don't know where you're going in the first place. Then, where the learner is now, for the teacher, that is eliciting evidence of that learning. So I'm making assessments in a session as we go. And how to get there, I then provide feedback to that learner that helps them move forward. Any feedback that doesn't help that is really not effective feedback. Now the peer and the student, the point is activating students as learning resources for each other. They're all on this journey together. They're all heading to a qualification that they want to achieve. So use them, encourage them to help each other, because this is this social constructivist learning. We cannot be really effective if we aren't talking with other people. And it will become more powerful because, as well as the feedback that I give as a tutor, you'll often have the feedback from your fellow students. And then if the student is the owner and feels empowered in their own learning, then their self-assessment matches to that. So then we have three. We have a teacher assessment, self-assessment and peer assessment, and that it will provide really powerful assessment and enhanced learning. It's what Dylan Wiliam and Paul Black are talking about. Okay, and then what we need to do is we need to use evidence of achievement to adapt what happens in that classroom to meet the learner's needs. Any formative assessment has to have value, has to have use, and we are using that as teachers to adapt and alter our lessons. You come back to some of the reflective cycles where you can go back and revisit content based on the fact that you know it wasn't achieved in the first place. Okay, methods of assessment. Now there are loads, and I'm sure if I asked you, you could just think of hundreds of them. So we've just some in here. We've got multiple choice assignments, examinations, worksheets, journals, presentations, puzzles, application form, etc., etc. So I'll let you read these at some other time. What's useful now is to start thinking, well, what type of assessment is that? Is that an initial diagnostic ipsative assessment? Is that a formative assessment? Or is that a summative assessment? We won't worry about the interim anymore. So, if I said we had a quiz, well, a quiz is actually a summative assessment because it's on the learning. It's happened for what's been learned. However, if you're using it in the middle of a session and then instantly acting on it, it is a summative assessment that you are using formatively. So it becomes an effective formative assessment. An essay. Well, an essay is a summative assessment. It can be used formatively, but basically it is something that happens on after the learning. You need to have all of the learning in place to construct the completed essay. Questions and answers. Well, that's a great formative assessment and one of the most powerful formative assessment methods used by teachers, and one you definitely want to master. You can ask a question straight away. Does that make sense? Do you understand that? You can make those questions even more effective by saying, so what do you mean by that? Or what do you think that actually really means? Portfolio. Well, a portfolio is an interesting one. The end portfolio is obviously the summative assessment. But in it, as it's being constructed, a learner is constructing that. So it makes it a peer ownership of learning. So that is peer assessment, self-assessment, not peer. And then also you can share that with other people. So it's a very formative approach. Well, we got assignments, examinations, good examples of summative assessments there. West Diagnostic. Well, it's diagnostic. It is finding out what your literacy levels are like and numeracy levels are like beforehand. So that is a initial assessment. You can use questions at the start of a session, as I was talking about. Find out what they know, which is assessing prior learning. And then these questions and answers can also be an initial assessment or ipsative. There is a Padlet on Moodle, which I shall just whiz over and open up. At the moment, at the time of recording, because I haven't delivered it yet, there isn't a lot on it. But I'll just pull up this Padlet for you. He says, da, 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 da. Okay, now I've filled in an example of a summative assessment that you can have a look at. And what I'd like you to do is move myself away again. Is to basically add to each of these, and maybe even add more. You can go and put another formative or another summative on afterwards. What we're looking for is a method. So the method, as this summative one, I've gone with an example of a multiple choice exam. You might use class discussion or something. Context, when is it used and what type of thing is it? So in this case, the context of this exam is at the end of the course. It's timed, formal written assessment, suitable maybe for a GCSE. Then have a list some examples of advantages of it, and then some disadvantages. Okay, brilliant. Let's go and take that away. Right, and then that is it for the assessment section. I have included my bibliography for this. I'm just going to close that PowerPoint. I don't know if I've saved it. I'm going to close that PowerPoint and now just come back to the Moodle here. It might have a different name by the time you get to it because we're constructing this ahead of delivery. So just going to quickly whiz through here. We've got tabbed sections. So these are the learning outcomes for Unit 305. And if you look at that now, you might well see that you can start to make sense of Learning Outcome 1 and Learning Outcome 2. We'll do a little bit more on Learning Outcome 4 soon. Number 3 is in the feedback session. Then you'll have the assignment submission, so this is where you'll upload stuff. It's not created yet, but it will be. And this is the other session on feedback, which is another part of this. And then there's this one here. You've also got your reading list if you're so interested. So there's the key part. You need to read the core textbook pages 171 to 246. And here is the extra reading. These are extra journals that I've posted up there. You just click on that. Now you don't necessarily have to read all of these, but they can be quite helpful for you for your assignments. Okay, well that's it for this one. Good luck. I hope you're enjoying the course, and I'll see you soon.